I want to focus my talk on something that will have value to everybody here regardless of what your discipline is. Those of you who are in criminal justice, I'm a little bit closer to that field, and so you may find a particular application for what I'm talking about. But I want to focus on intuition, which is one of the human mental resources. And those of you in criminal justice will see quickly how it applies to your work, but I'm hoping that anybody here will see how it applies to your life. What is it, first of all? Intuition is knowing something without knowing why. It is it's the journey from A to Z without stopping at all the letters on the way. It's coming to a conclusion quickly without necessarily taking the time at that moment to assess why you came to that conclusion. And you can think of it as like seeing the image before all the pieces of the puzzle are in place. You figure out what it is. And like every creature in nature, we are designed to protect ourselves from danger. And intuition is the primary resource that we use for protecting ourselves from danger. In fact, the root of the word, inter, it means to guard and to protect. And so most people don't make that connection between intuition and safety, but I'm hoping that today I can encourage that we all do that. In our case, when we look at ourselves relative to other animals, we didn't get the largest claws or the biggest fangs or the greatest muscles, but we did get the biggest brain. And that has allowed us to rise above all other animals in the food chain. There is nothing, not a single animal on earth, that looks at human beings as its primary prey. There's no animal walking around a forest or a jungle saying, I just can't wait to get me a human. And the reasons are that we're very bony, but above all, we're very dangerous. We are dangerous to the animals that would consider us to be prey. And so we can kill a bee or a whale or any animal on earth as a result of this big brain that we've got. And so the resource that we use most frequently in Western life, in Western cultures, is logic. I give you a logical reason why a thing is true. I don't just tell you it's my gut feeling, let's go with it. But the reality is that logic is plodding and unoriginal and far too slow to be useful in an emergency because it's slow to accept reality and it's burdened by judgment. And logic spends valuable time thinking about the way things ought to be or used to be or could be or might be. And in nature, an animal doesn't spend any time doing any of that. An animal threatened by another animal does not use logic. It uses intuition entirely. It responds either by intuition or by instinct. What's the difference? Instinct is inbred. It is inherent in the animal. But intuition is a process that is constantly learning. So we learn throughout our lives and we gain new distinctions about something, and then that goes into our process. We slow down as we're driving by the car accident, and we look. Why? Because we're gaining a piece of information. Ah, that intersection is blind. Ah, those small cars are dangerous. Ah, those young people drink too much and drive. Whatever it is that you take away from that accident, you take it away for the purposes of your survival. That's why we're fascinated with a recently discovered dead body, and we're not at all affected the same way by a mummy in the museum. Because the mummy in the museum has no relevance to us. The recently discovered dead body might be a disease of relevance to us, might be a virus of relevance to us, or it might be an injury that's caused by the greatest predator on earth, which is human beings, the ones we fear the most. We might think we fear sharks the most, but sharks can be entirely avoided. There's a perfect precaution for avoiding sharks, spoken in 5 words. Don't go in the ocean. Can't be simpler. But there is no perfect precaution for avoiding human predators or being safe from them. I want to tell you a fast story that's not in a book you would have read, involving a woman I interviewed named Kate. And she and her daughter used to go to movies with a group of other mothers every week. And they would go usually at dusk, so that by the time they came out of the theater it was dark, and they'd go in vans together or cars together or what have you. But on this particular movie, which was Jurassic Park, the mother took her daughter to see the film, and she parked far away from the theater because she had some shopping to do. She took stuff back to her car, and then she walked over to the theater. And in line at the theater, she was with all of her friends and with all of their daughters, and there was a man behind her who, for no reason that she could explain to you or me, made her uncomfortable. He was wearing a T-shirt, and the T-shirt said "Afraid of the Dark" on it. And he was wearing gym pants, and something about him gave her the creeps. And sure enough, as they were standing in line, he spoke to her, and he said, looking at all of the women and all of their daughters, he said, "Ladies' night out?" And she sort of said, "Uh-huh." She didn't want to engage with him. That's the end of the story in terms of everything that she had to react to involving that man. They then saw the movie about Jurassic Park, about ancient predators, and they came out of the movie, and one of the friends said to the mother, "Do you want to ride to your car?" And she said, "No, we're fine, we'll walk." And the moment she said that and saw the other mothers leave, she was upset. She realized she'd made a mistake, and she was thinking about that man. He wasn't even in the theater anymore, but that was on her mind as she and her daughter walked back the 2 blocks to her car. And so they walked down the street, and she could not shake the feeling of that guy in line. Now, we don't know today whether she saw him again out of the corner of her eye. We don't know what it is that pushed the intuitive button in her. But she began to walk faster and faster. And her daughter, who was 8 years old, said, "Is it a race?" And she said yes, and thought, "This will be a good idea, we'll run." And just as she began to run, she turned around, and sure enough, that man was following them. The man with the T-shirt that said "Afraid of the Dark." And she realized as they were running, they would not be able to outrun him. And she would have to get to the car and act very quickly. And she made the decision that she would get to the car, she would unlock the car on her daughter's side, put her daughter in, and then walk around to the other side. And she did all of that. She unlocked the car, and she walked around to the other side, but before she got into the car, the man was already upon her. And so she got herself into the seat of the car, and she just watched. And she said to me later, "I could see that my legs were kicking so much that he wouldn't be able to get hold of me." Basically, he had a position of disadvantage. And she said, "I thought to myself, car key, car key, car key." She said, "The next thing I realized, I kind of came back to consciousness in the car because the car door was slamming. And all the things that I'd told myself to do, start the car, drive away fast, I had done them." And she said, when I thought about the car key, I thought, well, I could put this in his eye. I could stick him in the eye with this key, and that would settle this problem very quickly. And she said, that is when I realized I had already done it. She had already stuck him in the eye with the car key. He was already sitting on the curb doing what men do when you stick them in the eye with a car key. And she had already driven away, and the car door had already slammed. All of these things had happened without her conscious participation. The only part that was conscious to her was the impulse that she got that said car key. And she said that she felt terrible and wouldn't want to blind somebody. And she said, at least I didn't, I could have stuck him in both eyes. At least I didn't do that. Turns out she had stuck him in both eyes and didn't even know it. And the next thing she heard was her daughter saying, "Mom, you didn't put your seatbelt on." So her daughter was pretty much insulated from the drama of the experience. And she said to me later on that she said it was a terrible thing to do. I felt like it was natural, that I was part of nature. And I said, well, sure. He did something very stupid. He attacked a woman who was with her young daughter. What do we all know about animals? You can walk past the elephants, but not if the cow rather is between, the calf is nearby. Or you can agitate the bear a little bit, but you sure can't agitate the mother bear who's with her cubs. And so he did basically a dumb thing and had the consequence for it. Later she explained to me that she knew that he didn't have a gun. I said, why did you know that? And she said because he was wearing a tight shirt, because he was wearing gym pants that wouldn't be strong enough at the belt to provide a gun, and because of what he did. If he'd had a gun, he might have just pointed a gun at me to get into the car or to get access to me, but he didn't do any of that. He did this other full-style attack that didn't work well for him. And so whether she's right or wrong about whether he had a gun, whether she's right or wrong about any of her assessments that come now after the fact, all of the work was done by intuition in an instant. And that resource, what I really hope you're left with today is that resource is absolutely brilliant, and it's our nuclear defense system if we listen to it. And it has a competitor in our mind. There's intuition standing here to guard and protect, and there's denial standing over here. Denial is the one that says, this isn't really happening to me. Oh, he's not really dangerous. I don't really have to worry about this problem. And the denial, there's a nice expression that says denial is not just a river in Africa. Right? Denial is a human resource that's enormously valuable to us for some things and enormously destructive to us for others. Example, you need denial to be willing to sit on top of a rocket ship that's lit and is flying into outer space. You need to be willing to compartmentalize and somewhat deny the risks. You need denial to build a bridge across an enormous river, particularly if you were the first person to ever do that. There are places where it's a valuable resource in our lives, but I would say for 90% of our lives, it's a tremendously destructive resource. It's the thing that allows us to not see something we're looking right at. If intuition is getting from A to Z without stopping along the way, or intuition is knowing without knowing why, then denial is seeing the thing clearly and choosing not to see it. It's denial to say, yes, my boyfriend was violent with me, but that's only when he drinks, or he had a really bad day at work, or he really apologized, or he says he won't do it again. That's denial. That's denial. That's really seeing the thing right in front of you and choosing not to see it. For women, in this culture, that is a consistent feature of their lives, in that they get a feeling about something and they override that feeling. And there's a great example of this that I think we can all relate to, which is, imagine a woman in a building late at night. She's on the 10th floor, and she pushes the button for the elevator. And the elevator comes, and the doors open, and there's a man inside who causes her fear. It might be the look of him, or what he's wearing, or the context, or whatever it may be. We don't need to know. She has a feeling of fear. And what does she do? She says, I don't want to be the kind of person who doesn't get into an elevator and reacts to fear. I don't want to be the kind of person who is afraid all the time. And so she gets into a steel, soundproof chamber with someone she's afraid of. And there is not another animal in nature that would even remotely consider such a thing. There's not another animal in nature that would say, danger over there, I'll go over there, except for the predators. And so if you can think about this in the context of animals, you cannot imagine an antelope in Africa that sees the lion or hears the breaking twigs in the brush in the night and turns with fear and then says, oh, it's probably nothing. But human beings do that every day, right? We undermine our own intuitive signals. And yet, we do know that there is a universal code of violence that we understand, meaning we know when someone is likely to be a predator. We've exchanged a whole series of signals with that person that's been refined over millions of years, messengers flying back between you and me that tell you that I'm not dangerous to you right now. And those messengers, when they fly back and forth between us and say, wait a minute, this is a problem. There's in the context I'm in a vulnerable situation and I feel that fear response. Those messengers are absolutely brilliant. And so I go to animals again. Imagine two wolves, and they come upon each other in the forest on some forest trail, and they don't know each other. And they look at each other, and they sniff, and one of their ears goes back, and then the tail becomes rigid, and the hair goes up on the back of their necks, and their mouths dry, and one attacks the other. Well, you cannot imagine that the victim wolf says, oh man, I had no idea that was coming. Because those were all signals. And human beings are no different than that. Human beings also give pre-incident indicators or signals prior to violence. The most preventable crime in America is spousal homicide, which happens, if you count boyfriends as well, that happens about once every 4 hours in America, that a woman is killed by a boyfriend or a husband. And about once a day about once every 8 hours that a husband is killed by a wife, although usually in self-defense. Whether it's immediate self-defense, meaning in the moment, or it's the belief that he's going to kill her at some time. Generally, the spousal homicides committed by women are more on the defense side. But Do those happen out of nowhere? Or is there a whole history that precedes it that is as predictable as water coming to a boil? He has been violent to her before. She has been afraid of him. He controls who she sees, what she wears, what friends she has. He has been reluctant to let her go. He has made threats that he would kill her in many cases. There's been a restraining order already. There's been 4 visits by the police to the house already for previous domestic violence incidents. So those are pre-incident indicators, right? Those are things that tell you that you're on a particular path. And you, the younger folks in the room who are students, you have a path that we can assess today. Let's say the predictive question is, will you finish college? What would be the pre-incident indicators to finishing college successfully? You buy the books, you show up on time, you complete the assignments. What would be the pre-incident indicators to failing to finish college? You don't buy the books, you don't show up on time, you don't finish the assignments, you sit in the back, you don't listen, you don't participate, you don't care, you don't graduate. It's not a mystery. So human behavior is highly predictable in that sense. And I've had a whole career of people telling me that, I've interviewed people who were victimized, and they tell me afterwards, boy, now that I think of it, I realize that I had seen that car before in the underground parking lot. Or now that I think of it, I realize that I had a feeling of hesitation when I dated that guy. Or now that I think of it, I realize that that guy in the market that did the robbery was wearing a big heavy jacket, and it was a hot day. And I say to them, if it's in your head now, it was obviously in your head then. So a whole career I have of people telling me it came out of nowhere. And then if I'm just quiet, if I take a breath, invariably they say, although, now that I think of it, and they give me the pre-incident indicators that they saw. And what they mean when they say, I realize this now, but I didn't know it then, is that they knew it then, but didn't recognize the significance then. And that's fine. That can happen. You can have a situation where you cannot prevail and predict victimization ahead of time. That happens as well, but it's quite rare. It's quite rare. There was a friend of mine who, named Cynthia, who had a building contractor she didn't trust. And she didn't like him, she didn't trust him, she felt he was overcharging, she felt his car was too fancy. There were a lot of things about him that she didn't like. And she finally fired him, she told me, after several times of talking to me about it, and she'd been reluctant to fire him. So I asked her, why did you do it? And she said, well, because Ginger, my dog, really didn't like him. Ginger used to growl when he came over. And I said to her, you realize Ginger was responding to you. Ginger doesn't know anything about contractors or whether 15% on top of the bid is too much or whether his car is too fancy. Ginger knows you very well. You know all about building contractors. You're the expert on that. And so, Ginger, or all dogs, people tend to invest them with the belief that they have some great intuitive skill. Dogs. They don't. What they have, however, is a lack of the things that get in our way. The dogs do not have things like judgment or wishes or opinions or denial. The dog never says, I wish this would be different, this situation I'm in. The dog never says, it shouldn't be this way, or it didn't used to be this way, or I won't accept it. The dog, like every animal, apprises the thing, sees it, takes it on board, and reacts. And they see things only as they are. What we do is cross-examine our own impulses. We get an intuitive impulse that you don't trust me for some reason. And then you say, well, hey, he's just come to the college, he's doing a nice thing, why wouldn't I trust him? And you go through this whole process of cross-examining your own feelings as opposed to just listening. And it's not that intuition will always be right, because your interpretation of it may not be right, but it will always have your best interest at heart, the intuitive feeling. Because it's not a conscious process. It's as clear as your kidney. There it is. It's part of the mind-body organism. And it's really good to listen to it. You're getting in the car, you're driving away, and you say, did I remember to turn off the burner on the stove on that rice I was cooking? Now, if you're close to home, you'd have to be a form of idiot to not stop the car and go check. But that's what a lot of people do. They get the signal and they don't check. If you're in Hawaii already and you've just flown there, I don't expect you to go back to your house and check. But if it's cheap meaning if it's an inexpensive precaution to apply, you go back into the house, you check the stove, and guess what? The fire's not on. That'll happen. That will happen. And it also, in my experience, something else will be revealed to you that was important. Oh, there's the briefcase I needed for this presentation, and I had left it behind. Typically, your mind does not, your mind in terms of intuition does not waste your time. Now there's another kind of thing which is worry and anxiety. Those are a different animal. I'll talk about those in a second. They're quite different. But what I'm encouraging here is that we do not spend critical mental resources during an emergency cross-examining our own feelings and trying to persuade ourselves that it isn't so. I interviewed a woman, I mean, it's an almost unbelievable story, but it's a true story, that she was grabbed from behind while she was going into her apartment by a man in Los Angeles, and he was wearing a ski mask. And as she turned around and saw him, the very first thought that went through her mind consciously was, oh, it's somebody who's going skiing. Forget that it's summer, forget that it's Los Angeles. Her first wish, her conscious wish was, it won't be what I think it is. Even though her body had already made the decision entirely, she'd already stepped back, and it was one of those apartment houses with a railing that he fell over. So her mind was way behind the physical reaction. It's a little bit like doing that when there's a bee in your hair. You do not say, I feel what might be a bee in my hair. I think I'll move my hand up and push it out of my hair. You've already responded long before you realize why. And that's something that is so valuable. In how does your mind communicate with you? How does intuition send signals to you? And it's not different it's not the same for all of us. Some of us get nagging feelings, or have a hunch, or have doubt, or suspicion, or gut feelings, or persistent feelings. Those are ways that that intuition communicates with you. One of the best ones is curiosity, because curiosity is simply the signal from your intuition that says, there's something more here I should learn. In the context of violence and risk and danger, it's very useful, but in everything it's very useful. Curiosity, there's something more here I have to learn. And so I'm curious, and I ask you a question. Are you from Boston? And then a conversation begins, and we go on. Are you from Boston, by the way? Okay, good. You're from Boston? I knew it was one of you. All right. So suspicion is another signal from intuition. Suspicion. And that's one that we often feel guilty about. I don't want to be suspicious of this person. But suspicion is exactly the same as curiosity, with only one small difference. It has the directive that you keep watching. It's the same animal. Curiosity is that there's something more here. Suspicion is that there's something more here and I should keep watching. And in fact, what is the root of the word suspicion? It is suspicere, which means to watch. To watch. And so there's nothing wrong with suspicion. You have suspicion about the nanny that you hired to watch your kids, and you think, I don't want to be suspicious of her. It's like you're doing something hurtful to her. You're not doing anything to her. You're just getting a piece of information. Your curiosity is stimulated, and rather than go like this and want to get away from it, you can be open to it and say, I wonder why that is. And it might be you'll conclude the nanny's terrific and everything's fine and you go on. Suspicion is not something you choose. It's something that chooses you. It comes to you. You do not choose to be suspicious. And so all of what I'm sharing is to encourage you to listen to these signals: doubt, curiosity, hesitation, suspicion, nagging feelings, dark humor. Dark humor is a great one. In my whole career, I've had so many cases where people ignored the messenger of dark humor. Here's an example of one. There's a California association called the California Forestry Association, a bit controversial at times because they're cutting down a lot of forests, and so they get adversaries who make threats or cause them problems. And there was a day in the California Forestry Association where the receptionists didn't come to work. So all the men who ran the organization were there with the mail arriving. And the mail had arrived with various packages, and one of them, the man shook one of the packages and says, gee, who's this from? Does anybody know this? And he looked at the package, and they all talked about what they should do with it. because it was addressed to the former president of the California Forestry Association. Should they send it to him? Should they keep it? What should they do with it? And then they began to be suspicious about the package. Why would somebody send a package here for the former president? He's been gone for 2 years. And at that moment, Gilbert Murray, who was the new president of the association, he arrived at work. He said, "What's up?" They said, "This package, it's kind of weird. We don't recognize who it's from, and we don't want to open it." And he said, "Cut the bullshit." And he took the package and he walked into his office. And one of the men, Robert Thompson, who was there, said, "I'm going back to my office. I don't want to be here when it blows up." And everybody laughed. It was a joke. It was dark humor. And he got about 10 paces down the hall before it blew up and killed his boss, Gilbert Murray. That was the second bomb sent by the Unabomber. Those of you old enough in the room to know the Unabomber will know that he sent a whole bunch of bombs. Now, the idea here isn't that we should all be thinking about bombs every time we receive a package at our homes, but the point is they were thinking about it. Right? He did say in the clearest possible language, "I'm going back to my office. I don't want to be here when it blows up." You can't get any clearer than that, but it was a joke. Now, where do those jokes come from? If you were just looking to say, "I think I'll say something funny right now," you might say maybe it's a package that was, maybe it's a fruitcake lost in the mail from 2 years ago. You could come up with anything. But this was not a man who tasked his mind to come up with something funny to say. Rather, this is a thought that arose. There it was. It was so ridiculous a thought, so extreme a thought, that it forms humor. It would be funny to say it. Some of our best humor are things that are a bit shocking to say. What's the primary element of humor? Surprise. And so that dark humor was a very important signal. There's another case of a plant, an industrial plant in California called Standard Gravure. A bunch of employees were sitting around. They heard some noises outside the lunchroom, and one of them said, "That's probably Joe Westbecker coming to finish us off," because he'd been a fired employee 2 weeks earlier. Of course, it was precisely Joe Westbecker coming to finish them off, including shooting and killing the man who said, "That's probably Joe Westbecker coming to finish us off." And so dark humor is really a good thing to listen to, because inherently, if you think about dark humor, it's not all that funny. Meaning, if you take it and change the context, I'm meeting with a client somewhere, and I say, "I'll see you tomorrow at 2:00," and he says, "If I'm not dead by then," it's not wildly funny. I usually sit down and say, "Where'd that come from?" And we talk about it a little bit more, because I'm dealing with people who are, wanting to talk to me because they're at risk of being harmed. So I'm not saying I don't chuckle at dark humor. I like it a lot. But the point is, you listen to it when it comes out of nowhere. And all the two victims I described to you just now both had all the information they needed to make the assessment. The package sent to the California Forestry Association had oil stains on the outside of it. It was bound with 2 kinds of tape. It had a return address that wasn't complete, and it was sent to a controversial organization during the time that the Unabomber was sending bombs and was in the mail. And so it's not crazy that somebody thought this could be a bomb. Now, the most urgent messenger of intuition is fear, true fear. And there's a difference between true fear and unwarranted fear. And I'll share that in a moment, but what I want to say about true fear is, what is its purpose in our lives? I don't mean the fear that I'll fail the class, or the fear that this girl won't go out with me, or the fear that I'll lose my job. Those are worry. Those are a different animal. True fear is a signal in the presence of danger. A signal in the presence of danger. And it's meant to be brief. That is true fear, in the presence of danger. If you have fear about something that is not present, that is usually anxiety or worry, right? For example, imagine you pick up the phone and somebody says, "I'll kill you tomorrow. I hate what you did and I'll kill you." Now, in fact, that's a death threat, right? Very scary to people. Your heart could start racing, etc. But I say to people, you could not get a better phone call than somebody who says, "I'm going to kill you," but is on the telephone, is about as undangerous as it could be. I mean, you have no emergency. The very fact that they're on the telephone is meaningful. They're distant. The very fact that they're choosing to tell you is interesting. They thought about hurting you, and they chose words that alarm over actions that harm. They had a choice. What do people really do when they intend to kill you? They kill you. They attack you. And so the idea that threats are inherently should be fear-provoking is one to consider, because according to the standard I've just provided, it cannot be a signal in the presence of danger. It can make you anxious, it can give you worry, but it's not the same thing. Now, I want to tell you what happens when you feel true fear. I don't mean the fear you get in a movie, but the real thing. What happens is it can literally take over your body, and fear will fairly instantly, in an emergency, stop time for you. And it either stops time or it speeds up time, whichever one you need, but ultimately time is forgotten, and everything is forgotten. And in those moments, those instances, life is no longer lived in the form of seconds. It's divided into milliseconds. And every tiny action that you might take is now under the control of these ancient internal guardians that I've been talking about, that have been basically waiting deep in your cells for this kind of emergency. And the heart rate will instantly jump. It can go to 200. And it does that for a good reason. It needs blood very quickly to get to the muscles. And then lactic acid will go to the muscles to pump them up to get ready for combat. And there's a cocktail of powerful chemicals that happen. You all know the famous one, which is adrenaline, a brain chemical. But most people don't know the more interesting one, which is called cortisol. And cortisol gets pumped into your body immediately, a brain chemical. And what it does is cause blood to clot. It causes blood to clot more quickly in the event you are cut. That's its purpose. And your muscles actually harden for resistance, for physical resistance, a form of armor. All of these things happen when you believe you're actually in the presence of danger and you're actually getting ready for combat. You can run faster, you can run farther, naturally, if you're being chased by something that wants to hurt you. And the five senses will take off. They'll start running in every possible direction and sending back information to your brain. And normally when you have, let's say I come into this classroom or you see me, all of the senses are involved, but we'll use one particular sense and focus it. I'm looking at you. But what happens in an emergency is all of that is overthrown, and all of the senses work together. And it may feel absolutely chaotic, but it's anything but chaotic. And if you let it, if you don't deny it, fear will get you out of most emergencies. And fear can get you to do things that you would never do in any other circumstance. In a sense, fear directly equals courage. Direct connection. There's a man I interviewed, an Australian man, who was attacked by a great white shark. Bad news. And fear gave him courage to do something that most people would never do. He was swimming in the water and he realized he was moving tremendously fast. That was his impulse. I mean, that was the first impulse that came into his head. And he looked down and he saw the entire head of a great white shark clamped onto his body. And he immediately, without thinking, doesn't know anything about sharks any more than any of us here, he began to caress the top of the shark's head like this, looking for the eyes. And when he found them, he put both his thumbs in very quickly, all the way in. He said they were like eggs. They just went right in. And the shark let go of him. But he held on to the shark as it swam down deeper. And he said later that he did that, he thinks, because he didn't want it to bite him again. He felt more comfortable hanging on. And it took him deeper and deeper and deeper, and then he pushed off and he swam up through his own blood and bubbles to the surface. And with 1,600 stitches, he lived. In other words, he did something that no one in this room, myself included, would ever volunteer to do on the basis of logic. But fear equals courage allowed him to do that. And intuition gave him all the information he needs. Perfectly logical if we think about it now. A shark has eyes, the only vulnerable part on his body. I can reach his eyes. I mean, I wouldn't think about it logically in that emergency, but he didn't have to because he reacted immediately as a result of intuition. So if you think of fear as being a brief signal in the presence of danger, then it's obviously something to listen to. Now, I said a moment ago that anxiety is a different thing entirely. How do you tell the difference between anxiety and worry and true fear? True fear, unwarranted fear. Here it is. Unwarranted fear will always be in response to something you imagine or something you remember. Unwarranted fear is always based on something in your imagination or your memory. And true fear is always based on something in your environment, something you sense, or in your situation. But unwarranted fear is always based on your memory or your imagination. Real-world example, you go to the airport, you're getting on a plane, and you get that impulse, don't get on the plane. This plane's going to crash. What's it based on? You ask yourself, where do I get that from? That news story I saw 2 weeks ago about that terrible plane crash in Peru, that terrible footage, whatever it is. But if you got that reaction because you just saw the pilot stumbling drunk out of the bar at the airport, that's a different thing. That's in your environment. That's something you perceive in your environment. And so you can quickly tell the difference between unwarranted fear and true fear. And the unwarranted fear, anxiety and all of that stuff, is very, very bad for us. Emily, give me a feel for how much more time you want me to talk.
I think there's questions, so maybe talk for 2 or 3 more minutes and then open it up for questions.
Okay. So a fast thing staying on emergencies. Knowledge is not particularly valuable during an emergency, knowing stuff. Because data is general, and emergencies are highly specific. And data is old, and emergencies are always right now, always current. And that's where you have to be in a real emergency, is to be in the now. And to detect pre-incident indicators of violence, you need to be present now. You could think of that word as pre-sent. You need to be there before your predator is there, ideally. And you can be certain that your predator, someone attacking you for some reason or choosing to victimize you, is absolutely present in that moment. He is not thinking about American Idol. He is not thinking about Syria. He is thinking about you and this action. And so the importance of being fully in the now is key. And fear will get you there if you let it. There is nothing that will get you more into the now than fear. And that is a truth that is widely abused by the news media. Because the news media is feeding our intuition information which is actually false frequently, meaning things that are not dangerous to us because they're too far away. I can't be burned by the fire in Mexico City, or they're too rare. I can't be affected by the one tainted turkey that was sold in Los Angeles last Thanksgiving and 6 million other people live there. But the news headline on CBS News says, could your family be next? True answer? No. Statistically speaking, it is literally 0% that my family will be next in getting a tainted turkey. Just like, cougar attacks campers. Could your family be next? No, because statistically speaking, that never happens on Earth. Yeah, it happens 3 or 4 times, but out of billions of people on Earth, that equals never. That equals no risk, no chance of me being attacked by a cougar while camping. And so it's important that we keep our intuition accurately informed and not buy into the idea that the local news, which is a business, will tell us what to be afraid of and program our fears. Mad cow disease, you're not getting it. Flesh-eating disease, you're not getting it. Killer bees coming from South America, not coming. So the local news, I've thought, should just begin the broadcast by saying, welcome to the Channel 2 News. We're surprised you made it through another day. And here's what happened to the people who didn't. And then they begin the death litany, the list of all the things that happened to a few people in a giant city like New York City in order to hold our attention. Vacuum cleaner dust kills 4-year-old. Expert, next up. Well, I have a 4-year-old, and so I think I have to watch that. Vacuum cleaner dust, and it turns out to be that a child put a vacuum cleaner bag over his head and suffocated. How many times in the history of the planet Earth has it happened? Once. Or a child's arm taken off in a laundromat, and the local assemblyman is out there saying, we have to do something about these laundromats and their safety concerns, and it's the top story on the local news in a city of 7 million people. And so what I encourage you on this is to get your information about risk when you seek it out, as opposed to when somebody tries to spit it at you through the local news. In your lives, your whole lives, all of you, it is likely that not a single thing you ever saw on the local news actually translated into something that enhanced your safety or might have caused you risk. And yet we all think, a rapist was arrested in the park. Yes, I'm very concerned about this rapist, says person on the street, number 1. And then number 2, we don't go in that park anymore. And I want to stop and say a rapist was arrested in the park. That means one less rapist. Good news. The park is safer than it ever was before. But the story is sold as if there are rapists in our parks. And so really looking at the news with a critical eye is a tremendously valuable thing to do. And now I shut up and ask for questions. I agree, I slightly amend that phrase in The Gift of Fear, the first book I wrote on this topic, by saying there is nothing to fear until you feel fear. But by the way, I happen to like that in the political context, what he said, and it applies very much to the post-9/11 age when we were suddenly afraid of things that happen once every 240 years. In fact, I would say police officers are not well trained in these situations because there's two forms of training. Training is the intentional teaching of information. Learning is the choice of what you take into your mind, right? And what do we really do? You're going to go to college for 2 years or 4 years or whatever it is. That's in the world of training. But the real learning you do here is what you choose to take on board from all of the resources that are provided to you. Well, police officers are dealing with a tremendous amount of information that comes to them outside of their training. Their training was 8 years ago, first of all, in an academy of 16 weeks, in which 4 days was on that topic, in front of a simulator, typically. But their learning includes all the stories they ever heard. And so typically, police officers become natural victims to the belief that demographics matters, right? The black person on the dark street is more dangerous to me than the white person on the same street. That's demographics. My belief is that demographics, age, race, anything that is not a choice, those are absolutely irrelevant to the moment I'm in. And so a woman in an elevator, true story with me, I was on an airplane and I was watching a guy sitting across the aisle talking to the 17-year-old girl who was sitting next to me. She was flying alone. And he said to her, he was putting on headphones, and he said to her, "I just can't get these things loud enough," with some sort of passion behind it. And she kind of reacted a little bit. And then he said, "Where are you going?" And she said, I'm going into Chicago. And he said, "Boy, I hate landing in an airport, and I don't know if anybody's going to be there to pick me up. This time I've got nobody picking me up." She said, "Me too." Because what he said was a question, is anybody picking you up? But he said it in this, this more clever way. And then he said, "Hi, my name's Billy." And he put his hand out. That's a question too. "What's your name?" And she answered it. And then he engaged her a bit, and he had a drink, an alcoholic drink, and he said, "Here." He handed it to her, and she didn't want it. And he said, "Come on, you're traveling by yourself. You're old enough to do what you want." And she took it, and she had a little sip. And I knew the whole thing was bad, right? In context, it's a bad circumstance. A nearly 50-year-old man talking to a young girl on an airplane with an energy that didn't feel good. If she were my daughter, I'd say, "Please leave her alone." And so I gave him a look, a sustained look, and he looked back at me and he said, "Getting out of Chicago?" And I sort of nodded, and I really looked at him. Crisp new jeans, muscular body, just out of prison. Right? That was the energy that I got from him. And so he got up to go to the bathroom. And coming to your question, I said to her, "May I speak with you for a moment?" And she became tense. Fantastic, right? She's not afraid of the guy giving her alcohol, but she's afraid of me. And so that's her learning is basically a lifetime of be concerned when somebody makes an unsolicited approach to you, but he'd gotten around all that through the strategies that he used. And so our learning about, I get into an elevator with somebody, I might be dressed like this, right? And I say to somebody, "What floor are you going to?" I would say to you. And some women in the elevator alone with me will tense up a bit, not want to respond, or want to push the button themselves, or whatever it may be. So that's not because of me, because I didn't do anything, right? There's nothing present in that experience, but it's based on their mislearning, the long learning. And so my belief is with police officers, and I think we just had one the other day with cops shot some guy 10 times. The firearms death rate in America has a large category. There's suicide, there's homicide, there's accidental death from bullets, and then there's a large category called legal intervention. That's police officers shooting people and killing them. My point there, it's a gross phrase, legal intervention, because that case is called legal intervention, right? He's not a homicide victim. So I said she said yes when I said, may I speak with you, and was a little bit put out by the whole idea that I would want to talk to her, but not put out that he would. And I said, that's not a good guy, that guy sitting over there. And he's going to ask you, he's going to offer you a ride home. And the next thing I saw, we landed, she didn't really engage with me, and we landed, and I saw the two of them talking at the luggage carousel, and she was walking away, and he was pissed off. There was an energy of anger. So hopefully she didn't accept a ride and let's share a taxi, whatever his thing was. And you know, some predictions are very, very easy, because I don't need to know he was in prison. I don't need to know that he was giving alcohol to a young girl. All of that can be set aside. Just context alone will allow you to make the entire prediction, which is 50-year-old man, 17-year-old girl don't know each other. You're really done at that point. And hey, phone's ringing. So that's what happened, which is hopefully that nothing happened or nothing adverse happened. I'll speak just generally about everything I would say to young women. I have two daughters who are now in their 20s, and you know, my overarching recommendation for women is to recognize that it is not a requirement that you be nice. That and when people are nice to you, niceness is often a strategy. It's not a feature of a human being, like how tall they are or what color hair they have. It's not just I'm just a nice guy, because I'm not a nice guy in a different context. I'm a nice guy in a particular context. And typically, particularly when you're talking about romantic engagements and the beginning of them, the seduction, the asking you out, etc., of course they're nice. What's the alternative? And so niceness is a strategy, and it is not a feature of a human being. And you can think of the issue that women are discouraged in this culture from saying no, in general. And even when they say it, they're not really heard. So in Western culture, when a man says no, it's the end of a discussion. And when a woman says no, it's the beginning of a negotiation. And so I ask you to go on a date, and you say, no, thanks. I say, do you want to, I'll buy you a drink, and you say, no, thanks. How many men say, okay, and walk away? That's not what happens. There's now a series of processes to break that no down and create a yes. And if I can create a yes in that circumstance, when you really meant no, then I know I have someone here where I can create a lot of yeses. In other words, I can have control. And so if there were one sentence that I would speak to young women, or all women, it would be that no is a complete sentence. Right? You are allowed to say no, and it need not be explained, and it need not be negotiated. And then for young men, it would be that you're allowed to hear it. And it doesn't mean you're not a virile pursuer of women if you accept that somebody says no. And in fact, as somebody who's dated a lot, I'm married now, but somebody who's dated a lot in my life, I can tell the young men in the room that if you accept the no and leave that person alone, you have you have an equal likelihood that she will make her way back to you at some time, particularly in a context like school where you're going to see somebody again. And if you're in a context where you're never going to see the person again, she really shouldn't get particularly engaged with you. Meaning you're at the supermarket, and it's not a context that's an easy context for the foundation of a relationship. And I realize now there's also internet as the foundation of a relationship, and a very statistically becoming a very meaningful one. But to the women, I would say, when you say no, it absolutely must not be negotiated. Now, you may still date that guy. You may get into all kinds of funny engagements with him that lead you to wanting to go out with him. But when you say no about something, you stick to your no. All of us, when somebody approaches you in a department store and says, may I help you? May I show you? Is there something particular you're looking for? I personally don't like to shop that way. I like to be left alone. And so I say, no, thanks. And of course, in that context, they keep at it, right? Are you sure there's nothing I can show you? We have a sale on such and such. No. And it's important to enforce your no if it was even worth saying in the first place. Otherwise, why say it? And so that's my brief thing on young women. Well, I think it does have everything to do with the media building up, because if you're walking down the street in your most natural incarnation as an animal with a great mind, you would really be much more interested in what's going on that street. Remember those women I talked about, one that dies every 4 hours by a husband or boyfriend? Most of them spent the preceding days thinking about terrorism, 9/11, mass shootings, their program fears. Their program fears, rather than the fears that were actually present in their lives. And so I would say the shooting in Washington, D.C., there is no rifle that gets bullets to come this far. We have absolutely no risk from it. And again, in statistical terms, it's a highly unlikely event. I think it's interesting, news means new, means something new. I changed that to say that news, N-E-W-S, means nothing ever worth seeing. Well, you mean how is it justified? Well, it would be, I don't know that anybody would have to justify it. It would be if the politicians are sufficiently moved by a population that's sufficiently energetic, there's no justification to it. It becomes the thing as it is. Here's the interesting thing about gun control. The United States does not have gun control in the sense of guns are legal. And so all the talk about what ought to be or should be or could be, as I said earlier, is irrelevant right now in a country where there are 20,000 guns entering the stream of commerce every day, and where there are more guns than adults, and where each gun has a shelf life of 400 years, meaning you have a product here you buy that outlives you. Nothing happens to it. And so the reality is that that's the reality. That's the only, all the talk about gun control is talk. The reality is the reality, and it's not even improved by legislation. Because, all right, so we would get rid of one particular kind of weapon. I'm not speaking in opposition or in favor of gun control here, but getting rid of one type of weapon, we're so far into this problem, the United States, with more guns than adults, and they don't go anywhere, that we're not resolving it through legislation. It's not going to happen that way. I do, of course, know what you mean. And it's not a dumb question. Any reaction that you give to an intuitive signal, I prefer the reaction of looking right at someone. Because in nature and in ancient combat, my adversary and I would size each other up. I'd be very interested, particularly pre-gun, we'd be very interested in his musculature and his height and his reach and his energy, all of these things that you're able to size up. A good friend of mine is one of the world's leading marathon runners, and he said when he could even get next to his competitor, the two of them would know immediately who was doing better. Just by running next to each other. Those are 1,000-mile races, right? They run for 1,000 miles, 1,000 times around a mile track, and yet they could still exchange these signals. So the story you just told where somebody's on the street and your shoulders tense up is a signal to him, right? Now, I'm not saying every one of those people was going to be a predator or a rapist, but the point is the early steps that lead up toward an engagement with you, talking to you, approaching you, following you, whatever it may be, that's the time to interrupt them, which your body did in that circumstance. Your body said, I'm aware of you, right? It's no different than me turning around and looking at somebody who's standing too close and saying, hey, I'm aware of you. And that's what, that's a huge part of your defense. As I say, I prefer looking at someone to showing fear, but nonetheless, they're the same thing, and you didn't think about it. Your shoulders just go up, and you just react.